of Orlando, Florida, you are listening to the most electrifying show in media, A Neighbor's Choice. And I am your host, David Gornoski, and thank you once again for joining me on this program in beautiful Orlando, Florida. I am so glad you've joined me in my neighborhood, and I am glad for all the people who follow us online at the various publications that carry my editorials and essays and interviews with some of the best thinkers and doers in the country and around the world. And we have another jam-packed program. We are about challenging groupthink or herd mentality. We don't want you to all be wolves, but we don't think we should all just be stuck in those herds, blindly going along with what everybody else is doing, including those in Washington who think they know better than us. And so on this program, we challenge groupthink. And joining me once again is my Chief Science Officer, Dr. Wei-Ping Yu.
Thank you, David, for having me again. Thanks.
And we are fired up because every show is an exploration. We explore the people who are affected by unjust laws. We explore people who are solving problems that government has failed to solve for many generations. We're dealing with the stories that the media really just doesn't give you a coverage for. You know why? Because the media loves dwelling on negativity. They love trapping human beings in a constant reciprocal pattern of despair and negativity. Why? Why would they do that? Well, maybe it has to do sometimes with the fact that, well, if you feel like you lack something and you're helpless, when you see the advertisers, maybe you'll want to buy something because you feel like you lack something existentially in your heart. After hearing the news tell you that everything's bad and nothing's ever good, maybe you'll buy their sponsors' products, their new car or something. I don't know. But somehow it seems like whenever you watch the media, you always just get feeling left helpless and kind of like nothing you can do will ever matter, right? You ever get that feeling when you hear the media?
Yes. I think, media just feeds people the needs.
Right.
People want to have an answer. So even though the answer may not be exactly correct, but somehow, it serves the purpose.
And now Dr. Yu, he's a top physicist in the aerospace engineering industry. He's involved with a lot of cutting-edge physics, and he challenges a lot of sacred cows in physics. And joining me in this first segment is a good friend of mine who does the same thing in his own field. He's in an area that is sorely lacking in government leadership, and that's economics. They tend to not really do well in economics, I think, government leadership, because we keep having debt, trillions of dollars in debt. And my guest now, his name is Jeff Deist. He's the president of Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama, the leading economic research institute for Austrian School of Economics. Jeff Deist, thanks for joining me.
Hi, David. Great to talk to you.
It's good to hear from you, and I know that you're on the cutting edge of trying to cut through all the noise of bad ideas that really plague academia and popular culture about economics and about the role of government in managing our affairs. Would you briefly, for those who are unfamiliar with Mises Institute, tell people what the Mises Institute is about?
Well, hopefully we're about teaching people what we consider proper economics. A lot of people today get through high school and even college without ever taking an economics course. And I think viewed correctly, economics is really part of a broader study of human action, not psychology or motivation, but what humans actually do. And I think it's critically important so that people are not susceptible to the claims of politicians. They're not susceptible to the claims of the media. They're not susceptible to claims of ideology without some thought and without some nuance on their part. So we hopefully fill a gap in people's lives and enable them to come learn about proper economics from our website, from our events, etc. And David, it's so important today that people have some grounding, some sense of first principles. Just the last 24 hours, if you're connected at all, we're hearing about Khashoggi, we're hearing about Stormy Daniels, we're hearing about Elizabeth Warren. And it's very easy to get sort of ping-ponged around while you're following the bouncing ball. And while this is happening, and your attention is diverted, a lot of things are happening in Washington on sort of a secular long-term level that have potentially very harmful effects for our prosperity, our well-being in the future. So it's tough. It's tough for people to be grounded today and remember, the foundation, the fundamentals, first principles.
Exactly. And what I love about you guys at the Mises Institute is you're willing to defy sacred dogma that I believe locks Washington in a kind of herd or groupthink days wherein they're not able to truly self-correct the deep problems that they're in terms of spending, in terms of debt, accruing trillions of dollars in debt. And, we had this recent, economic crisis in 2008, and they didn't learn the lessons. They just printed more money, created more money out of thin air, and they've just kind of passed the buck for the next big correction. And I think what you guys are doing is you're telling the unpretty lies, the unpretty truths about the pretty lies of Washington,
Well, it is interesting. We're still stuck in this mentality, which unfortunately came to dominate economics in the 20th century, that sees economics as a physical science almost. It applies mathematical models and statistical models to human action and says, well, gee whiz, in economics, just like in physics, let's say, we ought to be able to come up with a hypothesis, then go out and test it empirically and prove or disprove it. And, of course, economics as a social science isn't like that at all. This isn't math or physics. Human beings aren't molecules. Human beings are creatures with volition. They're oftentimes irrational. They sometimes do things one way for many, many years or decades or centuries and then suddenly shift. So really what we need to get back to is understanding some of the foundational principles of economics. And I would encourage people to go back and to read Adam Smith, to read Karl Marx, to read John Maynard Keynes, but to also read great Austrians like Ludwig von Mises or Murray Rothbard or Friedrich Hayek. And, a lot of people, economics isn't really their thing. It's not something that they're going to do in their spare time. They're busy with work and family. And so maybe they're not going to pick up a 500 or 900-page book. And we hope that those people will at least check out the Mises Institute, because we can sort of filter and distill for them a lot of knowledge in a pretty brief time. And just reading an article a day or occasionally maybe taking a free online course would in and of itself put them leaps and bounds ahead of the average man or woman on the street, because unfortunately not only are we becoming illiterate and innumerate, but we are quickly losing at the level of the common person any real understanding of economics.
Right. Now, I'm talking with Jeff Deist, the president of Mises Institute. If you want to visit their website, it's Mises.org. That's MISES.org. Check out, they've got all kinds of free materials and books available for sale. If you have a child who's in economics or a college student, or you're yourself and you want to brush up on what's really what is the field really all about in a really practical and easy to understand way. For those who are not familiar, you at the Mises Institute, you guys articulate a defense for what's known as the Austrian School of Economics. What is the Austrian School of Economics? Well,
it's really the dominant form of economics up until the Keynesian Revolution of the 1930s and the Great Depression. It is simply a school of economics that says, well, we ought to look at human action, and we ought to, from that, understand certain axioms and then sort of derive economic principles from that, instead of applying the so-called scientific method of testing hypotheses in the setting of a social science. So first and foremost, the Austrian school differs in methodology and approach. But more importantly, I think there are very different ways of looking at money. There are very different ways of looking at capital. And frankly, the dominant, or what we might reluctantly call the mainstream thought in economics today, is that the role of central banks and governments is to stimulate people to go buy stuff. that a robust or healthy economy is a high consumption economy. And if we just give people the ability to spend, even if that requires credit, that's the path to prosperity. And of course, that's not true. Prosperous societies accumulate. They make more than they consume, and they leave something for future generations. In fact, capital accumulation is another word for progress throughout human history. We've had generation after generation that left something more, something additional to the next generation. We can call that cultural capital. We can call it whatever we like. And now, in just the last 100 years or less, we've changed our minds and decided that consumption is the key. And so we need central banks and we need governments to stimulate people and make them want to buy more stuff. And I think this is a dangerous fundamental error. And if you look at our entitlement scenario, if you look at the U.S. dollar, if you look at the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, if you look at the euro and the ECB, I think it's something we're going to need to correct sooner rather than later.
And yet, Washington is dominated with all the top universities and think tanks with this obsession with Keynesianism, where you can have these equations and map out the destiny for 300 million or billions of people on the earth using these fancy equations. But, it's funny. I see a parallel here. But Dr. Yu, my physicist friend here, he notices problems in government-sponsored physics where they're obsessed with equations rather than the real world of how matter actually works. And when you get lost in elegant equations, just like you see that happening in government economics, you get lost in equations in physics too, and both mistakes lead to grave errors.
Yes. So in physics, the first principle is the first order. That's understand the physics before the second order expressed the physics. Use mathematical equation. Wow, Jeff, so I see similarities between economics and here. So my question is, do you believe, is that because economics theory is so difficult, so the people reading this theory doesn't really understand the social impact or response, or have some agenda?
Jeff, we're going to hold that thought just a second. We're going to take a quick commercial break. You're listening to A Neighbor's Choice on News Radio 93.1 WFLA. And welcome back to A Neighbor's Choice, the program where we don't rely on central planners and people to tell us what to think and what to do. We solve problems as neighbors, people with skin in the game, people with risk and chance and love for their neighbor, not interested in just, sticking in tribes and blaming other tribes and screaming about ridiculous non-issues and scandals and Stormy. We don't want any of that Stormy Daniels stuff. We're about real-world issues that matter for our children, our grandchildren, for our lives. And I'm speaking today with a guy on the front lines of giving economic sanity to the world, Jeff Deist, who's the president of the Mises Institute, one of the forefront free market think tanks in the world. And it's a pleasure to have you, Jeff. On the other side, before we were just asking you, Dr. Yu asked, why do you think there's such a predilection for Keynesian economics in the established economic circles?
Well, that's a good question. I think there's an agenda, but I also think there's a self-interest involved, a technocratic elite. If you look, for example, at most employees of the Federal Reserve Bank who are PhD economists, most of them came from the Ivy League, and they want to imagine themselves part of a knowledge set that ordinary people don't have, and they want ordinary people to sort of get out of the way and let them run things. And this isn't conspiratorial. It's just human nature. We naturally form ourselves into hierarchies and groups. It's just part of who we are. But we don't need technicians. We don't need mathematicians. We don't need theorists, or we don't even need philosophers to tell us certain things about human nature and thus certain things about economics. I'm sure, David, that you would understand that almost everyone would prefer to have their dream home at age 40 rather than age 90.
Right.
For the simple reason that at 90 you might not enjoy it very long. So
Right.
from this, we can derive what's known as time preference, and that means some people are willing to forego consuming or doing things they'd like to do with their money in order to spend, save, or invest it, and in exchange for doing that, for giving up consumption against the risk of time, any of us could perish tomorrow. They want to be paid in the form of something we call interest, which is a premium for time preference. So there's a lot of simple concepts that government and central banks have sort of made opaque, that we think interest rates, rather than just expressing the preferences of people who want to borrow money to buy that dream house at 40, and people who want to save money to get paid some interest, that we need technicians to come in and sort of determine what that rate of interest should be. I think that's false, first of all, but more importantly, I think it's very, very damaging. So because it seems like you need to have a PhD, like you need to be a physicist, because you need to be someone in the Ivy Leagues, we've allowed them to make economics seem more daunting and complicated than it is.
Well, we're trying to solve a problem here because we've noticed this same pattern. We do a lot of myth busting in the world of physics with Dr. Yu here. He's an insider of insiders in the physics community, but he knows there's a lot of the same problems going on with sometimes if you get into some of the special interests that coalesce around the physics establishment, and they have a vested self-interest in not challenging some of the original sacred cows that have been built up in the industry for decades, that's because the same problem. There's a certain kind of special power you have when you have arcane equations that nobody else can understand, and therefore you have a guaranteed job to be like a priestly caste,
Yes, I see exactly the similarity in the physics. Actually, in my opinion, physics even more simpler, even more intuitive than economics, which is more like a social, behavior. The physical is the day since you're born. You have a physical intuition, you have an experience, you know exactly what's right and wrong. So that's exactly happened in physics. You don't need a hierarchy authority, someone to tell you what is true and what is the matter and what is not true.
And we're speaking with Jeff Deist. He's the president of the Mises Institute. You can go to Mises, MISES.org. And Dr. Yu, my physicist, chief science officer, we're showing folks right now live how government monopolies tend to calcify and kind of create malinvestment of knowledge and information in both the field of economics and in the field of physics. And we're seeing a pattern here. Big government kind of creates problems for both. I often think, Jeff, in Dr. Yu's opinion, current standard model of physics says there has to be a macro physics kind of picture that's different from the micro picture, that these can't be simplified into one explanation. And that's very similar to what you find in economics, right? Establishment economics says, there's a completely different macro picture for how you should do economics, which is completely separate from microeconomics. But in your institute's opinion, no, it's one principle that explains both, right?
Absolutely. Only individuals act. And so looking at aggregates of individuals, which we call macroeconomics, is generally unhelpful. It treats humans, volitional actors, as data points. And again, humans aren't molecules. They aren't apples falling from trees. And what strikes me is when Dr. Yu talks about some of the orthodoxies in a physical science like physics, the one thing that unites economics and physics, social sciences, and so-called hard sciences is that they're all awfully close to the state. Because not all, but most, a large percentage of academia is state-funded, either directly through a public university or through the student loans, which are taxpayer-funded or taxpayer-subsidized, that make it so all those kids can go. And then a lot of them work outright for government, and then a lot of them, even in the university setting or the research setting, apply to the government for grants. And so certainly in the medical research field, we've seen what happens here is that a lot of promising ideas are mainstreamed or neutered And so we get the same old, just advancements in AIDS treatment drugs, a more sophisticated HIV cocktail, a cocktail that has perhaps fewer side effects, a cocktail that is perhaps more palatable to more people. What we don't get is something that kills the HIV virus. So there's a narrowing and a mainstreaming of academic work that occurs because there is a government funding pipeline.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I in Dr. Yu's opinion, we've explored this before, that the current state of model kind of shifts people's attention in physics towards, thermonuclear fusion projects that, in Dr. Yu's opinion, if they just questioned the government propped up physics science, they'd realize that these billion-dollar boondoggles will go nowhere. They're never going to produce excess energy in these big, giant nuclear fusion reactors.
Yes, actually, this is a funding structure determining the self-interest.
Right, if it's a monopoly funding structure.
It's a monopoly, which is the same thing. There's so much big institution research project could be simply solved by private, motivated individuals.
With skin in the game.
With skin.
That's the difference, right? Yeah.
Oh, my goodness.
So you see how we just showed there's a common problem here, that when you have big government propping up old ideas, whether it's in economics or physics, you're going to not solve problems like clean energy or more effective energy. You're going to waste billions of dollars in these government thermonuclear fusion reactors that are never producing excess energy. They're just a money pit. If they would question the fundamental principles of their equation obsession, they might realize that there's another way to do energy that wouldn't be so wasteful as nuclear fusion.
Exactly. And this is a funding structure, and also determining the tenures of academic staff. Yeah. They force people or make it more likely to be biased and to say something that may not be true to himself.
Right. Well, it's like the Federal Reserve System. I mean, they exist by creating trillions of dollars out of thin air, so they're not likely to put economists that are going to say you don't need a government to print money out of thin air. That would make them kind of cease to exist, wouldn't it?
Well, it is true, and you have to understand that there's an economic concept called sunk cost, and it's almost a psychological phenomenon, and it applies to all of us in our own work, our own investing, our own careers, which is when you put years and years and years into something, or lots and lots of money into something, and then it turns out it's a dead end or a bad path, we're not predisposed to just sort of fess up and admit that. We oftentimes tend to double down on our efforts or our funding in a particular area because there's almost an element of saving face or not embarrassing ourselves. And so, human beings, especially scientists, aren't real good at admitting when they're wrong. And of course, governments never have to admit that they're wrong because oftentimes the people the politicians who spent the money or passed the bills are long gone. They're no longer in office. They're dead, whatever it might be. So democratic government exacerbates all this because it's the opposite of skin in the game. It's people it's people promising people good, happy things. In other words, buttering up voters, and in exchange for things that they're spending or doing in the future. And if they don't work, the politicians themselves rarely suffer as a result.
Exactly. They don't get to reap the benefit or they reap benefits when they get, continual tenure or more research grants or nice pensions if they're a government employee. But then sometimes if they make a boondoggle that had no value, then they've allocated billions of dollars that could have gone to something useful in the economy into a dead end, and they reap no loss or no, exposure to the risk that they've created for everybody else. And Jeff, I want to get to kind of nuts and bolts for people, the average person. They're middle class or whatever. They're trying to navigate these wild times we're in. They see the news losing their mind. They see half the country thinking we're in controlled by some kind of a Nazi takeover with the Trump administration, and then the other half of the country is kind of missing the mark on some things too about how freedom is the fundamental ingredient to a flourishing society. So can you give anybody some wisdom or some things to navigate these turbulent times. I mean, we've got all this debt, right? And people are kind of, if you're awake to that, that's a big problem that's going to come to crash. How do we navigate these turbulent times using the wisdom and principles of free market economics?
Well, on a personal level, I think you have to arm yourself with some knowledge. You know, there's a price for everything, and you might need to go spend some time reading and learning about government, about fiscal policy, about monetary policy, about economics, even though that's not as fun as just turning on Netflix at the end of a long day. But if you do that, if you invest a little bit in yourself, not even any money, with all the wonderful things online today, you'll really be a lot more prepared. And one thing we do know is that economies tend to be cyclical. Now, different schools of economics can argue over why, but nonetheless, there's general agreement with that. And if we look at the last truly tumultuous economy in the United States, the Great Depression in the 1930s, people who had cash, in other words, who were savers, actually did pretty well because of the cost of a lot of things dropped and the purchasing power of the dollar went up. People who were in debt, who owed dollars, found themselves in dire straits and oftentimes unemployed and even out on the streets. So there's never been a time in human history where thrift and saving is a bad thing. I wish we could apply that at a national level, but if we can't, surely we can all attempt to apply it individually.
Do you think there's any lessons learned with the Trump phenomenon in terms of his campaign is all about nationalism versus globalism? Is that a trend that's helpful for liberty, in your opinion?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we'd need 3 hours to discuss that. But I think there's two different kinds of nationalism. There's a belligerent nationalism, which it tends to impose its way onto other nations. In other words, is outward looking. And I think there can be a reasonably benevolent nationalism, which is love of or pride for one's nation. And I don't think nation has to equal state. I think those are two different things. And a lot of libertarians are very cranky about certain things, and I understand that. But speaking for myself, I love America. I'm very appreciative of the wealth we have here, of the hot and cold running water, the electricity, the reasonable habitations, the roads, the medicine, the dental care, the cheap food relative to incomes. I mean, we're not living through the plague. We're not living through the Civil War. We're not living through the Great Depression. So none of us has the right, I think, to be gloomy relative to what many of our ancestors experienced.
Right. And if we love creativity and we love innovation and prosperity and we hate violence, we're going to want to look into free market economics as a guide to get us to a better place in our society. Jeff, thank you very much for being on the program. Everyone check out Mises.org. That's MISES.org. And go there to learn all about some cutting-edge research on the field of free market economics. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, gentlemen.
We'll be right back. This is David Gornoski on A Neighbor's Choice. We'll see you in just a second on News Radio 93.1 WFLA. And welcome back to A Neighbor's Choice. I'm your host, your neighbor, David Gornoski, and thank you for joining me again in this adventure on live radio each Tuesday evening at 8. I am so excited because now we have two physicists in the house tonight. This is more physics you're going to get in 1 hour of radio than anywhere else in media. I can assure you of that. And it's better than Bill Nye the Science Guy, okay? And no offense to him, he's a great guy. But we're going to go deeper and we're going to go stronger because we really are about challenging sacred cows and getting things done. The number to call if you have a question, I have two physicists in the house. These are people who are challenging some of the old ideas and trying to really put skin in the game, solve problems themselves. 407-916-5400. 407-916-5400. If you have a question, you're welcome to call and join in the discussion. on A Neighbor's Choice, we do a couple different things. We look at the news of the day and we analyze it and show the kind of misinformation and absurdity of the news media, kind of dissect that, and then bring us into a place of sanity. And that place of sanity we go in on the show is about challenging bad laws. We believe on this show that if there's no victim, then there should be no crime, law against someone. So if you don't have a victim in your action, then leave someone alone. And that's what liberty's all about. That's what prosperity and freedom is all about. And so on our program, oftentimes we'll have people challenging bad laws, or in our last segment, we had Jeff Deist, president of the Mises Institute, challenging outdated ideas about economics. And we're all about just trying to rethink where we're at and get things done. And so I'm excited to have in studio my friend Dr. Max Fomitchev-Zamilov. He is a engineering physicist in Florida, and I'm glad to have you on the program, Max.
Thank you, Dave.
And joining me also for our final segment is Dr. Weiping Yu, a NASA physicist, aerospace engineer, and I wanted to have you guys together because I wanted to have a meeting of the minds about thinking about what we can do to really tackle problems like energy. You know, I was looking at the headlines right now, and they were talking about this guy in Saudi Arabia who, they're trying to find out, did Saudi Arabia kill this guy? What's going on? And I thought, why are we so focused on the internal affairs of countries far away from us? Why can't we take care of problems ourselves? We seem so joined at the hip in that region. And the reason why is oil. We're so set on, okay, did who killed who in Saudi Arabia, and they're over in Yemen too right now, and we're providing support for their brutal campaign against the country of Yemen. That's something a lot of people don't hear about. Saudi Arabia is having America help them really do some brutal things to the people of Yemen. Why are we involved in there? And the elephant in the room is energy. And so I think we need energy independence. And I think we need to do it in a way that actually provides something that tackles two things, right? Avoiding wars for oil, avoiding entangling alliances with countries that really don't have our interests and we don't need to be involved in their affairs. And number two, having a society that has a pollution-free life, right? Where we don't have to breathe in dirty environments where we're going to have diseases and all kinds of problems. And so one of the things that I am interested in is the world of nuclear energy, and you're involved with that, Max.
That's correct.
And you used to be a professor at Penn State University.
That's right.
And why did you end up leaving that environment?
Well, academic environment is not necessarily the friendliest environment if you want to engage in research that's not funded by the government or is considered controversial. So a lot of scientists have to wait till they retire to really pursue what they wanted to work on for their entire life. So I decided not to wait till I'm that old. So I've been at university long enough. So I figured, it's time for me to leave and pursue the research in nuclear science that I always, wanted to pursue. But as I mentioned, it's kind of hard within the academic environment.
Now, your insights in the nuclear science field has a lot of parallels to what Dr. Yu says, because both of you have said there's a problem with big government funding of thermonuclear fusion reactors. Would you say so?
Yeah, I'd say, there are several big problems, and I'd say, the biggest problem is the government decides, which research it's going to fund and which research it's not going to fund based on current priorities. And, you can argue that, current priorities are correct or incorrect. I'd say, they're misplaced at best because, government, in my mind, should fund what's in the national interest of United States. But now United States is the leading oil and gas producer. So, one can argue it's not in U.S. national interest anymore to develop nuclear or any other form of energy because that would threaten oil and gas sector that's pumping all it can, and U.S. is starting to export liquefied natural gas to Europe. So I'd say it's not in U.S. national interest to develop nuclear or other forms of energy now that U.S. is one of the largest producers.
Dr. Yu, what do you think about the field of nuclear science? Why are we never getting any results in government research for nuclear science energy?
Max said very well. government decide which project to fund. But in itself, it's already vested. So the current, the called fusion, low temperature or something kind of fusion technology seems like more easier to getting grant instead of through other means to
right.
generate nuclear energy through other means instead of current means. However, so this is a dilemma for all the academic staff. Are you trying to pursue truth, solving energy true problem, or are you focused on your goal to get a tenure, to get
right.
research funding?
Yeah.
That's actually, there are different things.
Yeah, I actually would like to add to my previous thought. I think the second biggest reason is too big to fail. So a lot of these fusion-related projects, were funded for decades, and they have entire institutes and ecosystems and infrastructure built around them. So we have multiple researchers with career, tenure, students, postdocs, graduate students, you name it. Hundreds, if not thousands. You cannot really, leave those people out of the work. So this project, keep going and keep continuing because they are, literally too big to fail. And it's not just in fusion. That's, how a lot of projects in science are. Once they have the momentum, you just cannot stop it because, there's so much vested interest in it. So if there's anything that challenges, the status quo, it's not going to be looked at kindly, and it's a systematic problem.
And we're talking with Dr. Max Fomitchev-Zamilov. He's a physicist, engineer, and we're also talking with Dr. Yu, who is a leading physicist as well. We'll be right back in just a second. We want to go on the other side and learn more about what we can do to advance alternative energy breakthroughs in a way that doesn't bust the bank by having all these boondoggles with big government. We'll be back in just a second, folks. I'm David Gornoski, and this is News Radio 93.1 WFLA.
Hi, this is David Gornoski, founder of A Neighbor's Choice. A Neighbor's Choice is sponsored by people just like you, making weekly or monthly contributions to support the development of this show, which is dedicated to introducing Jesus' personhood revolution to the broader public. Visit www.aneighborschoice.com, click on Contribute, and start your monthly pledge today. We appreciate your support.
And welcome back to the most electrifying show in media, A Neighbor's Choice, the show that gets things done. And right now I have two of the smartest physicists with me right now trying to solve the problems of nuclear fusion, because we are about cultivation on this show, not consumption. In the first segment, we had Jeff Deist, president of the Mises Institute, reminding us that economics is not about consumption, but about saving and prosperity and building. And that's what cultivation's all about. We build something with our own skin. We roll up our sleeves. We get messy. We trial and error. And in this final segment, I just wanted to turn it over to the scientists. Any final questions or things?
Okay. I have a question for Max, since he's in the area of nuclear fusion.
Shoot.
So in your opinion, what make this big government-funded fusion project not successful?
Well, it's a very difficult problem, and that's what every fusion scientist will tell you. It's very difficult, and it stays difficult. So my quarrel with it is, if something is difficult, shouldn't you look for alternatives that might be simpler or easier? And I'll give you an anecdote. So when this country, when America went to space, they realized pens don't work in zero gravity. So NASA ended up spending a lot of money developing a pen that can not only write in space, but heck, why not underwater on hot surfaces, on greasy surfaces? And it was a $300,000 pen. Well, Russians used a pencil. So that's kind of the approach I'm after. I mean, we don't have to beat our head on the wall and trying to solve a very difficult problem. Why don't we look at an alternative or alternatives and see maybe there is another way we can accomplish the same result? That's not going to be as difficult or as capital intensive or as labor intensive.
So what kind of alternatives are you using?
Well, like Dave was saying, we have to roll up our sleeves and do it. So, I put my money where my mouth, or rather my mind was. And, I retired from university. I set up a home nuclear science lab and started, testing hypotheses, by other people and my own hypothesis. What we forget is we don't know everything about nuclear science. We don't know everything, about physics. So it's important to do basic research and see maybe there are other ways we can do nuclear reactions. Maybe, there are other ways we can accelerate natural radioactivity. Maybe there are other ways we can extract immense power from nuclear processes. And I'll give you an example. Few people know that lightning is actually a process that creates nuclear reactions. So only recently it has been, publicized that, antiparticles are detected in Earth's atmospheric gamma rays, neutrons, all sorts of, hard radiation originate from lightning. Why? There is no good answer. So, this is something that I'm studying in my lab now. I'm creating miniature lightning, and I'm trying to realize, why these nuclear reactions occur, how I can make them, go faster, more powerful to where, something, more useful could come out of it.
So what kind of astounding results come out of your research?
Well, one result is very interesting. For example, when you create a discharge, you expect the energy of the resulting X-rays to match the voltage that was used in a discharge. For example, if you use 30,000 volts to create a discharge, a miniature lightning, you expect to get an X-rays at about 30,000 electron volts in energy. But what I am observing is even at such a low voltage, I get X-rays in the range of several mega electron volts, and that's potentially a very interesting result. And similar results were obtained and published in literature pertaining to lightning, but we don't really know what voltage is in lightning. We think it's millions and millions of volts, and likely that's to be true. But in the lab, when tests were conducted, and I like a work by a particular Russian team that used a 1,000,000-volt discharge. So they detected X-rays. I don't think they measured gamma, but they couldn't explain why they were getting neutrons in their process because the energy of their discharge, wasn't high enough to produce neutrons, but neutrons were produced. So I kind of decided to build on that a little bit and created a miniature discharge. Didn't get quite neutrons out of it, but got very high energy gamma rays.
Wow, folks, this has been another explosive show. We are trying to unlock the mysteries of nature, and I'm going to have next week, we're going to have a poet in studio. Say, hey, Jordan.
Good evening.
We're going to have him next week because we want to show poetry in motion with science to show how we can solve the problems ourselves. We don't need those big guys telling us what to think. This has been another episode of A Neighbor's Choice. I'm your host, David Gornoski. We'll see you next Tuesday night at 8. News Radio 93.1 WFLA. Godspeed.